Hi, I'm Allie Morris. I'm a senior at the University of Science and Arts of Oklahoma, and today I will be discussing how the Constitution had been warped in the 20th and 21st century because presidents have sought increased unilateral action and a deferential Congress have voluntarily relinquished their war power responsibilities. Though this warping of the American Constitution was not inevitable, as presidents in the 18th and 19th centuries successfully maintained the Constitution, after President Woodrow Wilson in 1912, the Constitution had been distorted by the president legalizing his unilateral action in war. And after the Cold War, Congress had warped the Constitution by voluntarily ending their war power responsibilities. But first, it is important to understand what parts of the Constitution the American presidents and Congress have warped. In Article 2, the framers gave the executive the role of commander-in-chief, granting him the authority to lead the nation through a threat of war. Most presidents, even George Washington, interpret this title as authorization for the executive to take the lead in protecting the nation from war or lead the nation through war. While the president is the commander, he is also forced to deliberate with Congress before initiating military action. In Article 1, the framers balanced the strength of the commander-in-chief by giving Congress the sole responsibility to declare war. President's war duty is then limited by Congress's responsibility of declaring war, forcing deliberation between the two branches. Understanding the size of the commander, the framers granted Congress the powers to match the strength of the president, including raising and supporting armies, providing a navy, and being the sole source of funding. But to go further into determining the original framework and the intended war responsibilities for the executive and legislative branch, the analysis of scholarly influence helps gain a better understanding. Though John Locke is more often credited as the primary influence, it is concluded that Baron de Montesquieu had the most impact on creating presidential and congressional war powers. Locke's interpretation of a constitution provides that the executive can go outside the law for public good. This more closely mirrors what the 20th and 21st century presidents will use to distort the Constitution. Instead, as shown in Montesquieu reflecting the framers' document, a constitution should have a ballast, or the weight that holds a ship steady, deliberation, and the branches that should work in tandem. During George Washington, James Polk, Abraham Lincoln, and William McKinley's presidential terms, both the executive and the legislative branch upheld their oath of protection to the Constitution, as the two branches maintained the Montesquieuian deliberation, initiated stability, and worked in tandem with Congress. Presidents Washington and Lincoln led the United States through extreme emergencies that had the potential of destroying the nation. President Polk and the 55th Congress during McKinley's administration led to fulfill their ambitious and glory-seeking motives. Yet in both dangerous and ambitious wars, Montesquieu and the framers' constitutional design was not distorted. Washington, in perfect Montesquieuian fashion, chose to first deliberate among his cabinet members, inquiring what the president is able to do and what he should do. Understanding that this threat to the American people and the young experiment required a quick decision, Washington and his cabinet members decided that issuing the Neutrality Proclamation without calling Congress into session would be the appropriate response to the emergency. Though this proclamation without congressional authority seems to be unilaterally decided by the executive, Washington maintained the ballast by seeking retroactive congressional approval to implement the strict neutrality. And almost a century later, President Lincoln utilized Washington's precedent to cure the nation of a large and imminent threat. Like Washington, Lincoln had a well-defined threat in the realm of war, which had the potential to destroy the entire Union, and sought retroactive approval to stay within the limits and scope of the Constitution. As the Union began to dissipate before the newly elected president, Lincoln made unilateral decisions while still maintaining the Constitution. He properly deferred and gave ultimate power to Congress, ensuring that there was deliberation and a ballast that would not allow the president to take such expansive actions if it was not believed to be justified. He deliberated among his cabinet, like Washington, and when it was safe to do so, he worked in tandem with Congress. Montesquieu and the framers also understood that ambition is inherently part of the government, risking the nation into glory wars. The Constitution was not equipped to prevent these ambitious leaders, but it was created to ensure that the other branch's power acted as a ballast to keep the ambition steady. In the Mexican-American War in 1846 and the Spanish-American War in 1898, Polk and the 55th Congress acted on their human nature of ambition, leading the country into two wars that were purely glory-seeking for expansion of land and power. Still, the Montesquieuian system acted as it should, not by ending this ambition, but by successfully counteracting the ambition in the other branch. For these two wars, it exemplified that an ambitious president and an ambitious Congress are not capable of warping the Constitution when the other branch enacts the Montesquieuian duty of the ballast. However, the presidential and congressional precedent, combined with America's new leading role on the world stage after 19th century expansion, created new possibilities for constitutional warping, beginning with a president that started the decline of the constitutional fervor. President Woodrow Wilson leveraged the precedent of the Humanitarian Congress and the Spanish-American War to trumpet democracy as the world's highest form of government. In an attempt to enact his true destiny as peace broker and world leader, Wilson was the first president to diagnose the Montesquieuian Constitution as the issue. Deliberation, a ballast, and working in tandem with Congress did not suit Wilson's interpretation of presidential power, and he began to create a new order based on this desire. He argued that to achieve the president's war goals, the executive has to circumvent Congress. He introduced the League of Nations, and though it didn't pass Congress, the idea of the Lockean prerogative, or reaching outside the law for public good, was utilized by future presidents to distort the Constitution. Woodrow Wilson in World War I initiated the first major crack in the 100 years of successful Montesquieuian constitutionalism in the realm of war. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is considered to be perhaps one of the most revered presidents among Washington and President Lincoln. Yet he did more than his share to warp the framers' intent regarding constitutional war powers. Roosevelt easily took on Wilson's ideological mantras of legalized Lockean prerogative and circumventing Congress. With the coupling of his successful use of past precedents and the size of the looming emergency in the 1930s and 40s, Roosevelt expanded the existing small cracks in the Constitution into a floodgate. In 1940, Roosevelt added other legal means, ignoring the Constitution to continue his power over Congress. His passage of the Destroyers for Bases deal usurped congressional authority as Attorney General Robert Jackson analyzed the president's actions against new legal arguments, not against the Constitution. Emerging from two world wars, the question then shifted from what the president should do to what the president can legally do. While Montesquieu and the framers predicted ambitious presidents and damaging wars, they did not predict presidents using legalization other than the document they created, nor a docile Congress forfeiting their assertions. Presidents nor Congress looked at the Constitution for authorization anymore, but relied on newly formed documentation for presidents to legalize their actions. The United Nations Charter and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, and the authorization for use of military force, as well as even the War Powers Resolution, which was a congressional resolution, breathed new life into a disfigured constitution. Presidents use these modern documents to legalize their unilateral military actions, creating confusing policy, switching from one extreme to the next, and imitating some of the most poorly executed wars in history long after the Cold War ended. Presidents today are firmly placed on this foundation of the warped Constitution, creating war policy that can no longer remain within the moderate American Constitution. It isn't the modern presidents who have warped the Constitution, but they have simply just followed the precedent that the executive before them have set. Democratic Senator from Illinois, Barack Obama, sought to restore the constitutional balance with the intransigent Republican flip legislature openly acting to disregard Obama's policies and Obama's multiple tools for Lockean legalization, this warped Constitution remained. Presidential candidate Donald Trump also seemed to notice the consequence of a warped Constitution, but he continued to utilize the warped Constitution as well by initiating missile strikes in Syria in 2018 in response to a chemical attack allegedly ordered by Bashar Assad against his people, and of course he did this without congressional approval. In January 2020, Congress finally reasserted themselves under the Iran Powers Resolution. U.S. Senator Mike Lee saw the warped Constitution and remarkably recognized that it is Congress that should reassert themselves, restoring Montesquieu's and the framers' war responsibility of deliberation, a ballast, or a steadiness, and force the president to work together. This perhaps would initiate the reversal of warping the Constitution and reinstitute the framers' intentions. Yet this nation continues to be living under the dangerously warped Constitution in the realm of war. With unidentifiable emergencies, the executive's Lockean legalization, and a weak Congress, it seems that the government will continue to warp the Constitution. Though in replacement of congressional ballast, the last remaining check on the president is the American people and their vote. Should the constitutional warping come to an end, it has to become the people's responsibility to reestablish what Montesquieu and the framers originally intended in the realm of war. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.